Thank you very much for having me here. I'm not going to take too much time to talk because we're going to have a conversation and Q&A. Basically what I'm going to tell you here from the point of view of science and math and technology, I used to teach those things for many years, is the argument that we need to bring back the small data to the conversation. Now when we have several years of kind of a big data era where people more and more around the world really believe that it's a data through student assessments and many other ways that will somehow fix the education system and solve the problems. How many of you have heard about small data before? How many of you think you know what the small data means? Okay, so not too many people. Big data is well known, right? But let me start by this statement that was in a New Yorker a few months ago, where the author said that we don't really discover stuff anymore, that we just go to the internet and Google things. And this is, I work a lot with the policymakers around the world, and this is what they seem to be doing. You know, their work is very busy, so they don't have time to really do any research or investigate things. So they just ask their advisors to go and Google something. So you get all sorts of stuff, information, and also data when you go and Google. Sometimes it's right and sometimes it's not. Okay, so you may get things like this. Okay, so if you go and Google and ask, so what drives learning in classroom in general? What are the things that are the most important things for students learning? You get something like this, that the most important single factor in improving quality of education is teachers. This is actually a real statement from a policy document here in the United States. Now, let me ask you this. If you read this, your kind of a first impression, do you think this is a fact or myth? Think about it just for a few seconds and then turn to somebody who's sitting next to you and say that, what would you say if you were asked this question as an advisor to the minister or somebody else, that should I think this as a fact or as a myth? Very quickly, your first idea. You know, if you ever work with a policy, if you ever advise a minister, like I'm advising several ministers around the world right now, they don't want to have long answers. They just want to have you answer yes or no, and then we move forward. So let me ask you this. If you think that this is a fact, that you would introduce this piece of information as a fact to somebody who is responsible for policies, raise your hand up if you think that this is true. Okay? Now, look around. And if you think that this is a myth, that it's not true, raise your hand. It's very interesting. You know, it's about half and half. And then we have some people here who have no opinion. It's like in this election, you haven't decided yet. Yeah. So, you know, this is very interesting because we can look at this type of statements, and there are many things like this. First of all, this is absolutely critical for the policy here in the United States. Because if you think that this is true, then of course the consequence is that then of course teachers are the most important thing, okay? And good teachers is something that we need to have. And bad teachers are those guys we have to get somehow rid of, okay? And then it starts to accumulate all of these things and policies that you see here and many other countries of teacher assessments and all sorts of other things that try to remove the bad teachers away and bring good teachers in. This is a myth, okay? And it's a myth for many reasons. First of all, the research from the last 50 years is very clear that teachers are not the most powerful factors behind the students' learning. For example, your own statistical association says something like this. It's something between 1 and 14% of the variation of student learning that can be associated to teachers. Okay, so everything else is something else. Most important factor explaining students' learning in math and science and many other things is a family background, where kids come from. Okay, so if you want to improve education, not school, education here, you have to prove the conditions where the kids live and where they are raised and where they are born. Okay, the teachers can only do that much. Okay, but my presentation is not about that. I just wanted to give you this idea. The big data, this is something that everybody knows. It's a kind of a massive amount of information and data collected that we cannot handle anymore in our kind of a daily devices. That we need to have a huge machinery to do this. So, for example, your national assessments here that the states and federal education system is doing is a good example of education big data, that you have a huge amount of information about students learning in math and science and maybe some other things around this country that we can call big data. Internationally, how many of you have heard about PISA study? OECD PISA, almost everybody, because PISA is measuring math and science performance of 15-year-olds around the world, really. And PISA is a very good example of the big data example globally. What we need to keep in mind is that at best, in education, the big data can only help us to see correlations, not causation. We can only see how things in education, teaching and learning are linked together, but we don't know which one is causing the other one. And this is where things are getting beautifully messed up, particularly when it goes to policy making. For example, the data from PISA has been used for all sorts of different arguments, explaining many things. For example, taking the PISA data and something else you can explain, you can, for example, say that the more you consume ice cream, better your science and math scores are in your country, okay? Because there is a correlation. Of course, everybody knows that there's no causal relationship between eating ice cream and doing well in math and science, okay? But these are the kind of things that people mix and mess up in countries at the highest level of policy making. So how about the small data? What do I mean by this? First of all, I think that the small data is an old idea. It's something that teachers who were teaching math and science like myself many years ago, we used to work with small data every day. It's something that we see ourselves and we collect in our classrooms and schools, and we use it for understanding what works in a classroom. And my way of thinking here is that now when we have this big data increasingly entering in the world of teachers who are teaching science and math, that teachers are kind of giving away the small data part of their work and believe that it's a big data that will help us to see how to teach math and science, okay? Especially in places like United States, where you are much higher test and assessed in your classrooms in math and science than in most other countries in the world. So the small data for me is something, like I write here, it's a small clues that teachers observe in their work that help them to uncover the relationships between teaching and learning, so how children learn. Big data can never help teachers to really understand why and how children learn science and math, but even more importantly, why they don't learn. And this is something that I think is a kind of an undermined part of teaching STEM everywhere, is that why kids don't really learn what they're supposed to learn. I'll give you a couple of classical examples of this that the big data is not able to cover, that we need to have focus on small data if we want to help our teachers to teach better science and math everywhere, including Finland. The first one, everybody knows, you all have heard about this misconception about why we have seasons, right? And this is a classical thing, and this happens everywhere. If you ask children, why do we have spring and summer and winter and fall and so on, the most often heard explanation is that because in the summer, Earth is closer to the sun than in the winter, because they remember this kind of elliptic type of thing. Of course, this has nothing to do with the scientific explanation for this type of thing. We have similar types of things in mechanics and electricity and you name it, in physics, for example. And if teacher really wants to understand why children are not learning science, they have to really get into this level of trying to understand what the preconceptions or misconceptions or alternative frameworks of children when they try to learn science are. What we know from research is that these children's own ideas of science, for example this one, are very permanent. That kids are likely to keep their own alternative misconceptions even if the teacher is trying to teach that this is not the right way to think. As soon as you close the door, your science class door, the kids, they return to their own explanation of, why things are in the world as they are. And if we don't pay any attention to those things, kids don't learn science. And I would argue that much of these kind of difficulties we have in learning science and math and many other things is that we ignore the power of misconceptions or these alternative frameworks that kids have. And big data is not helpful in that. So in mathematics, I used to do for many years research on what we call images of mathematics. So we're basically asking children of different ages in different countries around the world, that what do they think when they think about mathematician or mathematics. It's a very interesting stuff. This is a very common way how I think a 10-year-old student draw when we ask them to draw a picture of mathematician. Look at this image. You know, if your idea of mathematician is something like this, and this is a very common, by far this is the most kind of a dominant idea of what the mathematicians do. Who would like to be a mathematician? You know, these kids say that they are ugly, they are untidy, they don't have any friends, and you know, all those, they are not married. And you know, if we don't pay attention to these things, these images and ideas, kids are not going to learn mathematics. That's for sure. And if we are not using, you know, focusing on small data in our math classes, teachers will never understand these. They just keep on teaching math as if all the kids were kind of interested in these things. So that's why we need to have a focus on small data. So my conclusion here, I leave you with 3 ideas that I think we could do, and some of us, for example, in my country, Finland, we are doing these things. The first understanding is that we need to keep in mind that big data is about correlations, small data is more about causation. So if we really want to understand what works in our science and math classes, we need to have small data. That's my argument here. The second one is that we need to have a better balance, particularly here in the United States and some other countries as well, between the census-based, kind of a large-scale national or statewide assessments and classroom assessment. I have been in many, many schools and classrooms here where teachers say that they have no preparation anymore to do any assessment in their work, whether it's a science or math, because most or all of the data and testing is done by external measures. And if we don't have teachers in our classrooms who are able to assess these things, then we're going to mix and ignore all of these things that I have said before. So we need to have, I think here in America, you could do much less census-based standardized testing and replace that with the different type of approach to try to understand what's happening in the classroom. And finally, just like in Finland, the school principals and administrators should be spending more time in the classroom teaching. In my country, most of the school principals also teach. So they're teaching in a classroom, not much, few hours a week, but they teach enough to, you know, keep this understanding and touch to the practice, okay? Here in America, I don't know, you know this probably better than I do, but most of the school principals and administrators that I've met never teach anymore. So they're just admin, to the admin work for the school. And if you never visit the classroom as a teacher, you don't really have any connection to the small data anymore. So that's why I think it's a very good idea to develop the principalship in a school level in a way that principals could also teach. Just think about somebody who is a math teacher and a school principal. If he or she would teach 2 or 3 hours, one class a week, it would make a huge difference in understanding what's really going on in the school. And this also applies with the superintendents and legislators. I think it's a great idea to insist that people who are deciding about the policies of our schools should sometimes visit the schools. I was in Birmingham, Alabama earlier this week, and there were people who were really excited about this idea of holding politicians and legislators accountable for visiting schools enough so that they would really understand what's going on there. And that's also because they need this small data as well together with the big data. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Have a seat.
Thank you.
Kind of following up on the last point there, where maybe Alabama is a good example. There's a lot of people here who are interested or directly influence policy in the United States, and we've mentioned in a few different talks the sort of place we're in terms of politics and policy. But what have been successful measures of change? If you have a system that's been built and reinforced for standardized testing, you know, in your experience looking at different countries as they move themselves forward, have been successful places to start going back to a different kind of measurement?
Are you thinking about in general or particularly math and science, STEM in general? Maybe?
I will open it up to general.
Okay, yeah. Well, you know, one thing, and this has been my research for the last 10 years. So I've been asking this question: that what are the countries that seem to be doing well in education overall, like Canada, Finland, Singapore, South Korea, the Netherlands, some of those. There's not too many of those countries. What do they have there done? Exactly this question that you asked. And there are several things. One is that all of those countries, they have elevated the teaching and leadership profession to be a kind of what we call a high profession, so that every single one who is teaching math or science, first of all, that they have to have strong basis in the stuff that they teach. It's very difficult to teach something that you don't know yourself. You can do that, but you will never be successful in it. Like, let me give you an example of myself. So I was teaching math and science in junior high school and high school. So first I had to do, and it's the same thing still in Finland and other countries, I had to do a master's degree in mathematics, okay? And then earn my teaching diploma, and then teach with this master's knowledge of math junior high school students. And this is what everybody's doing now, that we understand that you cannot be a successful teacher in these subjects if you don't master the subject yourself. And then the pedagogy, the education part of this has to come into the picture. Then the other one, you mentioned the standardized testing thing. There's no high-performing or well-performing education system in the world that would think today that standardized testing and data is the best way or the necessary way to improve the performance. They are not doing that. Many of the education systems that have had kind of a heavy hand on testing, like some of the provinces in Canada, that they are doing away now this census-based testing and replacing that with the teacher or classroom-based testing. That is more about assessment for learning, so that the assessment would be used for learning science and math rather than just collecting data. Then thirdly, I think the leadership issue is absolutely critical. That is, again, a little bit different here in the United States. All of those high-performing systems that they have professional leader in a school. Like Finland, for example, you cannot lead a school unless you are qualified to teach in that same school. So you have to be qualified to teach something in that school before you can lead the school. And I think it's a very good principle because it also requires that you really have to understand what's going on in the classrooms. You are able to help and advise and coach your teachers that you can't do if you're not qualified to teach in that school.
And then kind of along the same thread, and perhaps somewhat selfishly since I have you here, but we have organizations that are part of companies that create either products, technologies, et cetera, to foster learning. What would be your advice to them as they go forward in trying to help a better learning education experience, as opposed to, to a certain extent, we can fall to the same trap of just getting students to, to the test. What would be good habits of the commercial side of the?
That's a great. If I had an answer to this, I would be a rich guy, I guess. I would not be sitting here. No, but first of all, I want to say this to everybody here: is that, and I was speaking. I gave a talk last night in Wellesley College to an audience.
You have been busy.
And one of my main messages was that America has been and continues to be a kind of a hotspot for innovation in teaching and learning, the pedagogy. The most interesting ideas are taking place in this country. The most important research on teaching and learning is happening here in America. So I think you have already, your problem is not a kind of a lack of good ideas. And many of those ideas are with the companies and firms that are developing and creating and testing the new tools and devices and ways to teach and learn. I think your challenge is much more about getting rid of the wrong type of policies, because what you're doing in this country now, I can tell you this straight away now when this is an election period, so we have to be honest about things, right? Is that the things that you have in your education thinking at the level of the federation or most of the states is the wrong way to go. There's no successful education system that has never been able to be successful, high-performing system with the ideas that are now driving your education reforms here. Namely the competition, standardization, testing, all those things that are making particularly science and math teaching very, very difficult. I don't believe that kids will learn better mathematics by teaching them more or insisting them to do more homework. We have to do these things differently. And I know that there are many people in this room who are trying to do that, but you cannot implement these great ideas that you have in a system that is completely inappropriately designed in terms of helping children to learn science. Science, you cannot learn science by force. You can learn science when you have room to, just like I heard some of these presentations here, that you need to have room to think. You need to have room to make mistakes. But think about American education, teaching and learning culture now. To make a mistake is the worst thing you can do. That's when you are fired and you get a bad grade and those things. So we need to bring many of those ideas that we heard to the system. But because your kind of a daily practices in your schools are so overloaded by many of these things, it's very difficult to do right things when you are so busy all the time doing those things. So, my recommendation, simple one, that doesn't cost anything. Anybody can do that. Some of your districts and schools are now doing this because of these recommendations and conversations we have had in Vermont and Texas and Georgia and now in Alabama, is that give your children time to do their own things between the classes, particularly after math and science and technology class. It's a very bad idea to move children from one place to another without giving them a proper recess to think and try to make sense out of those things that they have been trying to learn in the classroom. In Finland, for example, we have 45 minutes to learn science, then we have 15 minutes for kids to do whatever they want to do at all levels, from kindergarten to grade 12. And this is the key thing, particularly in learning, if you want your young people to learn math and science better. They need to have more time to sit down, go outside the classroom to the schoolyard and just try to make sense out of this material that had been exposed to. Now what you do, and you know this better than I do, that most schools here in America, most public schools particularly, don't have any recess anymore. Or there is this 3-minute recess policy where they hardly can put the stuff in their bag and take the new things on their desks. You need to give your children time to, clear their mind a little bit and get ready for the new thing. Without that, things will not change. As I said, this doesn't cost anything. You can start this next Monday, and I can tell you one thing: it's going to make a huge difference. It's going to be a game changer in most of the schools if you can introduce this type of culture that you used to have here earlier, but not anymore.
Now I'm feeling like we should have had a 15-minute break after this.
It's a good idea, by the way.
And then sort of final question before I'll open up to the group. But for people who are interested in sort of learning more about small data, there was a good portion of the audience that hadn't. What would be sort of recommended places to engage for them?
No, it's small data, as I said, it's going back to the good old days that you used to have. When American colleagues, my friends from here, when they visit Finland and some other places, but particularly Finland, their first reaction is that, this looks like America was in the 1970s. That there's a lot of freedom, there's respect to teachers, and they have time to do these things. Teachers can collaborate. Nobody's competing too much. They help and share things. What has happened here? So, the small data idea it's a kind of a renaissance of what it used to be when teachers had a key role in collecting and using the data in the school. Now, I think you particularly, I think you need to be more mindful in, creating a kind of an impression that the data somehow, the more data will help your schools to get better. I don't think that that's going to happen. That it's going to be a different type of data. I have nothing against big data. I think we need these assessments. We need to see how systems work. But by thinking that just by having more and more that data, things will get better, that will not happen. So that's why I think the small data is more like a complement. If you want to read an interesting book, Martin Lindström, who's a Danish guy, he wrote this book called Small Data about 6 months ago. It's not about education, but it's about how he's consulting different businesses around the world and how businesses have been able to turn around what they do by focusing together with the big data, the small data. Lego company in Denmark is a good example of this. Lego almost went away from the market before they realized that they have to, in order to understand how the markets operate, they have to look at the small data. So that's a kind of, it's exactly the same thing in education. If the teachers and principals don't pay attention to these small, often invisible items in a place called school, they will begin to do wrong things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.